Welcome. Good evening. It's good to see you all this afternoon, this evening. My name is Rob. I'm with the Institute for Creation Research here in Dallas, Texas. Like I mentioned earlier today, we're all sheltering in place right now. We're coming to you from different places around the Metroplex. And I know that you enjoyed Dr. Cleary's talk earlier today about the geological nature of Mount St. Helens. And today, Mr. Sherwin is going to be talking about the biological recovery of Mount St. Helens after the eruptions, how life resumed and went back to normal in a sense. And so he'll be talking to you about that. This is going to be about a 40 to 50 minute lecture. So I would encourage you to tune in. Feel free to also reference this video later on our Facebook and also on YouTube and other platforms as well. Mr. Sherwin is our biology, zoology expert at ICR. He has a bachelor's degree in biology from Western State College in Gunnison, Colorado. He also attended graduate school at the University of Northern Colorado, where he studied under the late Gerald Schmidt, who was one of the foremost parasitologists in America at that time. He also found a new species of parasites that I don't know if you'll have time to talk to about that today, but you should ask him sometime about that. So anyways, Mr. Sherwin, go ahead and get started.
Okay, thank you very much, Rob, and hello to everybody. I trust that you are all recovering from this COVID situation and hunkered down and doing what needs to be done. So we're going to look at, in just a brief time that we have together, about the biological recovery of Mount St. Helens, a catastrophic explosion that occurred on May 18th, 1980, and Dr. Clary has already told you about that. And really, truly, Mount St. Helens is what we like to call an outdoor creation science laboratory. It is exciting to see what happened at Mount St. Helens. Of course, we are sorry to have the loss of life that did occur when Mount St. Helens blew up. But with that said, let's just go ahead and look at the lack of uniformitarian ideas associated with the Mount St. Helens explosion and the follow-up after that explosion occurred. Now, uniformitarianism is a belief system that includes many millions of years that supposedly, allegedly occurred in the history of this planet. Uniformitarianism got to be very popular about 150, 200 years ago, according to some geologists and even a lawyer at that time. But we're not going to get into that so much, except to show that Mount St. Helens simply does not follow the uniformitarian paradigm. For example, there was rapid strata formation. That was a very ununiformitarian process and a procedure. Rapid strata formation, there was rapid erosion of canyons, such as the North Fork of the Toutle River that occurred in 1982. Another explosion, Mount St. Helens, on a reduced scale that formed the erosion of these canyons. Rapid deposition of upright logs in Spirit Lake, 6 miles approximately from the summit of what was once Mount St. Helens. And we find many upright logs up and down in the bottom of Spirit Lake. Rapid burial of peat, again, in Spirit Lake that occurred rapidly. Rapid glacier formation. One geologist said, everybody's excited about what happened at Mount St. Helens in terms of the explosion. He went on to say the glacier formation is at least as fascinating as the actual eruption event. And a rapid rock slab growth in the lava dome. Talk about strange. A very bizarre rock slab growth that occurred several decades ago, but it was very fascinating from a geologic perspective, and it was very rapid. And rapid lava cooling that makes rocks with potassium argon appear millions of years old. But the thing that I would like to talk about is the rapid recovery of the ecosystem, the plants and animals that were devastated by the Mount St. Helens explosion of May 18th, 1980. Well, there was significant recovery after the flood, and again, the key word is rapid. And after a natural disaster, creation scientists observed environmental recovery processes and then extrapolate, and we do that in science on occasion, extrapolate to the worldwide reclamation after the Genesis flood. Mount St. Helens continues to be a scale model of the world that God destroyed and reformed as a result of his judgment approximately 4,500 years ago. Well, when Noah and his family looked out of the bleak and barren post-flood landscape, they must have wondered, how long would it remain that way? The place must have looked like a thermonuclear blast zone. There'd be absolutely nothing there after the scouring of the Genesis flood, a lot of water over a year's time, that would cause them to ask that question. How long would things be that way? And more than a few scientists wondered how long it would take for the recovery of Mount St. Helens, which, as former President Carter said, looked like a lunar landscape, absolutely devastated. Well, it's been 4 decades since the eruption of Mount St. Helens, and it's given ecologists an extraordinary opportunity to witness the steps through which the biological environment has reclaimed a devastated landscape. Here we find tree trunks that are spread across a wide area that looks like matchsticks. And there's no growth of any kind of plants at all right after the explosion. No wonder so many people felt that it would be a century or more before Mount St. Helens could fully recover. Well, why is studying Mount St. Helens so important, especially from a Genesis flood perspective? Well, Mount St. Helens has impacted many areas of science, especially ecology. And ecology means the study of the relationships of creatures to their environment, both the living environment and what we call the abiotic, or the non-living environment. Recovery by flora and fauna, the plants and animals in the devastated area around the volcano, occurred very quickly. Many centuries are not required to turn a lifeless terrain into a lush biota. Plant and animal repopulation was and is remarkably fast. And to put the emphasis right here, all of this has implications for the worldwide flood, as we read about in the Book of Beginnings, the early chapters of the Book of Genesis. So, are there examples of rapid recovery in a devastated ecosystem? And the answer is we have a number of examples of rapid recovery, not just recovery, but rapid recovery in ecosystems that have been devastated by natural processes. For example, oil-eating bacteria have started to clean the Deepwater Horizon spill. That was said about a decade ago. And the Discover article said, now a team of American scientists have shown that just a month or so after the incident, that is after the blowout of this oil well in the Gulf of Mexico, a microscopic cleanup crew of the genus Volcano had already started to digest the mess. Who would have guessed that you would have a species of bacteria, or several species to be specific, a number of species of bacteria that can actually eat hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbon is simply a molecule that is composed of carbon and hydrogen. And these species of bacteria can actually eat the oil. Petroleum-eating bacteria, which had dined for eons on oil seeping naturally through the sea floor, proliferated in the cloud of oil that drifted underwater for months after the tragic 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil rig accident. They not only outcompeted fellow microbes, they each ramped up their own internal metabolic machinery to digest the oil as efficiently as possible, according to a Washington Post article, August of 2010. Imagine that, again, bacteria that can get fat and happy eating oil. The result was a nature-made cleanup crew capable of reducing the amount of oil in the undersea plume by half about every 3 days. That's an amazing process that can occur, and again, we would emphasize, very quickly, very rapidly. And the research was published in the prestigious Science magazine, And this was said back in August of 2010. An incredible cleanup crew of bacteria that cleaned up this plume by half about every 3 days. That's amazing. Well, there's also rapid recovery that occurred in Washington state when a dam was removed. Science Daily says the response of the ecosystem was, using their words, incredible and faster than some experts expected. Christopher Tanya, an ecologist at Ohio State, quote, watched reservoir beds that looked like moonscapes return to vibrant, rich habitat, and cascades emerge where none had been, at least for the last century. So they're finding just a very rapid recovery of a dam that was removed, again, in Washington state. And David Coppage said that the Washington River system rapidly recovered. Today, songbirds sing in the trees, river dippers hunt in the waters, and salmon are well on the road to recovery. And look at this, all in one generation. That must have been shocking to geologists accustomed to thinking of slow and gradual change over millions of years. Again, that's the philosophy that is called uniformitarianism. Quote, the areas previously depleted of salmon are on a fast track to recovery in a shorter time than he ever expected after the dam removal, Tondra said. And these two last slides are according to a Science Daily article, December of 2015. Well, that brings us to one of my favorites, which is the island of Surtsey. Now, Surtsey is an island that's found very close to Iceland in the North Atlantic Ocean. And Surtsey is a good example of a mature and varied landscape that developed in just a few months. In other words, rapidly. Again, that's the key word, following the island's volcanic formation in the Atlantic Ocean in 1963. And so why is studying Surtsey so important? Well, obviously that has implications for the Genesis flood and recovery 4,500 years ago, right at the end of the Genesis flood. Together, about 60 plant species, including mosses, lichens, and an evergreen shrub, have been established since Surtsey was formed in the early 60s. Its rapidly growing ecosystem is powerful evidence against critics who claim that the Earth could not possibly have recovered yet from a worldwide flood that happened only thousands of years ago. Surtsey shows that they're wrong. Also, Mount St. Helens shows that they're wrong. And numerous other examples of devastating events that occurred that recovered rapidly. A life scientist who studied Surtsey stated in 2008, and I quote, Surtsey always provides surprises. We discover about 20 new species of life forms each year. And so we can see the rapid proliferation of the fauna and the flora on Surtsey very, very rapidly. And let's not forget about what's happening today, literally today, with wild animals rapidly repopulating urban areas during the COVID-19 crisis. How quickly animals are rewilding, if that's a word, rewilding our urban spaces is pretty encouraging, according to one researcher from X Prize's Ocean Initiative team. And they're talking about animals, wild animals that are coming into urban areas, such as deer. Now, this does happen on occasion, even without the COVID-19, but not to the vast numbers that they're seeing throughout the world. Also, in the country of Wales, in Britain, they're finding that several cities are being overrun by goats. And so these are just two very small examples of what's happening a lot throughout the world because of this COVID situation, as wild animals are coming in and repopulating in a very short period of time. As it says in the headline there, wild animals rapidly repopulating. And as the quote said, how quickly animals are rewilding. So this is happening quickly, rapidly. It doesn't take an enormous period of time. Well, what about the rapid ecological recovery of Mount St. Helens? That's really what we're interested in. But I wanted to show you that these kinds of events, such as what we see at Mount St. Helens, are hardly unique. They happen all the time when there's devastation throughout the world, ecological, environmental, and so forth. These are images showing from a weather satellite how Mount St. Helens has recovered, at least in terms of vegetation. And the upper left-hand diagram, the picture there is 1979 all the way down to the year 2017 in the lower right-hand portion. And you go through several years taking specific pictures and seeing that the vegetation is getting more lush and more concentrated there in the Mount St. Helens area, and it doesn't take extremely long periods of time to recover. It just takes the conditions that we see, and in just several decades, we are seeing significant repopulation and regrowth. Well, recovery includes something that we call in biology succession. If you ever took high school or college biology, you may be reminded, this word may be something that you studied in high school or an introductory biology class in college. Succession is a progressive change in species composition of a community of organisms from initial colonization of a bare area. So that's called primary succession, when you start with a bare rock that was once sterile. For example, the island of Surtsey, as it came up out of the sea, that rock was essentially sterile for hours, maybe a few days, before bacteria and viruses and so forth began to slowly get established there. But what we find is that primary succession, even though it starts with bare rock, can occur very, very quickly. This comes from Encyclopedia Britannica, 2006, showing the progression of succession, specifically primary succession. In the far left-hand side of the screen, you see bare rock. Well, that's the way it was at the island of Surtsey. As it came up out of the sea, you had bare rock, and then through time, we find what we call pioneer species, specifically lichens and small annual plants, plus the lichens, began to get established. But once again, without harping on this too much, it doesn't take inordinate time periods for this to occur. So you have from the primary succession getting into, for example, grasses and perennials. It goes through decades, and yes, to get to shade-tolerant trees such as oak and hickory, yeah, it might take a century or two. But again, you've got all of this other undergrowth that has been occurring at a rapid pace. And here we have primary succession, since we are talking about Surtsey right here. This picture was taken, bare rock on the island of Surtsey, and it shows the establishment of perennials, annuals, and some lichens that have become established. It doesn't take a long period of time. So Mount St. Helens could really be seen with its catastrophic explosion as being something akin to a sterilization event. When Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, it destroyed every living thing around it. Gas, ash, and rock, heated to over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, sterilized a 60-kilometer square area, leaving a gray lunar-looking landscape, devoid of animals and plants. It really must have looked like, and you can see from the picture there, like a thermonuclear blast zone. No wonder scientists who were involved in looking at and evaluating what happened were pretty much convinced that nothing was going to be established for probably centuries, some of them were saying. Yes, a few of them are saying, well, it's going to take decades. But really, this area was so incredibly devastated, nobody could figure out how it could ever become reestablished. But it did, and we would say in record time. It seems as though Mount St. Helens might remain a wasteland forever. Then, to everyone's surprise, life began to bloom again. And this comes from a NOVA KBPS program, October of 2012. and they showed this picture. And this picture, I think, is significant because it shows a lone lupine, which is a type of flower that can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. And that's a very difficult procedure, but this delicate flower can do this because of nitrogen fixing bacteria that it has with it. It gets into a lot of biochemistry, but it's a fascinating and very complex process. And these lupines, alpine lupines, are simply one of the first plants to get established. And it was hardly a wasteland forever. Everyone's surprised, life began to bloom again. So Mount St. Helens thrives, as one article said. Williams said in May 6th of 2020, it's pretty recent, flora and fauna have more than returned to the destruction zone. They are thriving. And certainly that's true in these 4 decades since the Mount St. Helens explosion. Things are thriving, both animals and plants, in the Mount St. Helens area. There's just been rapid recovery. The recovery of Mount St. Helens area was a wonderful living laboratory to investigate how ecosystems and species responded to and recover from major disturbances, said a research ecologist with the Pacific Northwest Research Station in Amboy, Washington State. Furthermore, this natural experiment gave scientists plenty of surprises and has revealed some important factors that influence how an ecosystem recovers from such widespread devastation. You know, a blast from a volcano, we can certainly say that's a widespread devastation. We could also say the same thing regarding the worldwide Genesis flood. Water becomes a very potent scouring of the environment. Running water is very, very devastating. And then they go on to say which have used to study other areas impacted by volcanic eruptions. And this was said a decade ago in Live Science. So primary succession is something we've already discussed as an area recovers from devastation. Primary succession follows a sequence similar to the revegetation we see right here in Mount St. Helens. And in these 2 pictures that you see before you, these plants are called fireweed. Fireweed began growing through the ash within weeks of the eruption. So fireweed got established, and it is designed by the creator to be one of the first species of flowering plants to recover after a devastation such as a forest fire or a volcanic eruption. Well, here's some succession of Mount St. Helens just to show you it's the same place, but at different years, at the exact same place, showing succession can be very rapid at Mount St. Helens, showing kind of I think they're separated by about a decade here, and showing you the same view there and the rapid succession of the fauna, the flora that can occur. Well, I couldn't get through this presentation without showing you a picture that I took when I went to Mount St. Helens about 15 years ago. I was driving through and I wanted to look at the North Fork of the Toutle River. And this is where this picture was taken, very close to the North Fork of the Toutle River, because I wanted you to see this picture taken from the road there. And this is where one company that grows trees had their sign that says planted in 1985. Look at all of that growth since the year 1985. It's lush. The trees are really starting to fill in. And so I really was impressed that when they planted these plants in 1985, that years later we would have something like this. What an incredible recovery of the Mount St. Helens blast zone. And lupines that I'd mentioned earlier, some of the post-flood, what we call the post-eruption plants are seen, were one of the first plants seen after the explosion of Mount St. Helens. Lupines are what we call legumes, which live in close association with a special bacteria that metabolizes nitrogen from the air. Nitrogen in the air is called N2. It's 2 nitrogen atoms, but they're held together by 3 bonds. And it takes a stick of dynamite and an act of Congress to break those three bonds, which are so tight. But the creator has designed this bacteria with certain enzymes that can break those three bonds between the two nitrogen atoms without any problem at all. Again, we would say evidence of design and of creation. And so these lupines are very special plants with this special type of bacteria that metabolize nitrogen from the air. But there's also animals as well. There's been a surprising amphibian recovery, such as biologists were absolutely shocked to find that most of the area's amphibian species, like frogs and newts, had survived the blast. The eruption created an array of 150 ponds that actually encouraged the amphibians to widen their territory. And again, this comes from an article about 10 years ago, but it shows that there was quite a recovery. As a matter of fact, there was an explosion of amphibian populations because of these added ponds. And of course, elk have returned to the blast zone as well. This is a very famous picture showing elk returning just a few years after the Mount St. Helens explosion. Why did they come there? Well, one is there were some succulent plants that were starting to show up, and so they made short work of that. But also, this was a volcanic area, and volcanism means heat. And so wildlife biologists figured that they, meaning the elk and the deer and other animals, were coming back to have heat during the winter months. And so they also found that elk were giving birth to almost twice as many offspring than normal. And so the elk returned to the blast zone to eat the succulent plants that were just growing in and to enjoy the heat from the volcanic activity. Elk populations reached several hundred animals within 5 years of the 1980 eruption. And so this is very interesting to see these large mammals returning and proliferating soon after the Mount St. Helens explosion. Mountain goats as well. Though the blast decimated the area's herd, which wasn't particularly large to begin with, said one reporter, the alpine ungulates, that is the mountain goats, are now a common sight to hikers and are plentiful. And so this was reported way back in the year 2020. And I'll end with this, wild strawberries, because they are so delicious. And it's really neat that these wild strawberries are coming in and filling in the areas of the devastated Mount St. Helens environment. The same author said in 2020, while not one of the most ecologically notable returns, the spring fruit always amazes United States Geological Survey volcanologist Alexa Van Eaton, quote, "The most gorgeous volcano in the world, so entrenched in our story of the Pacific Northwest, and it erupts tiny strawberries we can eat," end quote. So let's conclude. Mount St. Helens is a scale model of the world God destroyed and reformed as a result of Noah's flood, both in the fauna as well as the flora. And that creation scientists will continue to use Mount St. Helens as a living laboratory to study the devastating effects of events like the global flood and Earth's rapid recovery in miniature. It is truly a lasting monument to catastrophe.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Sherwin. Thank you for that presentation. I appreciate you looking into that and to also teach us about some of these things of how this rapid recovery that you mentioned, I think is so interesting. And hopefully for you who are watching that this is helpful and encouraging for you. So this is actually the conclusion of our time together today. Thank you so much for joining us as we celebrated the 40th anniversary of Mount St. Helens eruption. We hope that this information was helpful for you as you continue to study how science continually confirms the Bible. If you're interested and would like to learn some more information, you can check out our website at www.icr.org for more information. And there's also a search function on our main webpage that allows you to search past articles that Mr. Sherwin and our other scientists have written on many different topics. If you're interested in keeping up with our newest research and discoveries, you can sign up for our free monthly magazine paid for by our donors called Acts and Facts by going to our website, www.icr.org/subscriptions. And thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you all again soon.